Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks for your presence in this panel, the first panel of the afternoon. We would like to first introduce the people who are going to participate in the panel. They are all Mexican. By the way, I'm Cristina Gomes from Brazil, but now naturalized Mexican 30 years ago. I'm a researcher of the Latin American department in Flaxo, Mexico. I work racism and eugenics. The first presenter is Guilherme Franco de Lima, a Brazilian Mexican. He has a master's degree in administration and marketing. He studied his second career in law. Also, he has participated in different spaces like Semarnat, environmental rights, with a project in Jalisco for vulnerable populations. Currently, he works as a lawyer in the area of criminology and human rights. Then we have Xiomara Garduño. She's a nurse specialized in family health by the Autonomous University of State of Mexico, with a teaching trajectory at the Autonomous University of the State of Mexico. She has a master's degree in population and development by Flaxo, Mexico. She's currently working mental health in teenagers and vulnerable population. Our next participant is Grecia Rauda. She's a physician from the state of Guerrero. She has African American ascendancy. Well, hello. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Grecia Rauda. I'm originally from Acapulco, Guerrero, in the southern part of Mexico. I am a physician graduated by the Autonomous University of Guerrero, of the state of Guerrero. I am member of the collectives of Afro powerful women of the coast of the state of Guerrero, and we advocate for the rights of Mexican Afro ascendancy women. I work as a physician in a first level health facility in a community of the state of Guerrero. There, I have been in contact with a number of communities and municipalities where we have Afro descendant population as well as indigenous population. Thank you. Okay, so I will give the floor to Guilherme. He's going to introduce eugenics in Mexico and racial. By the way, you all have 20 minutes. Well, each of you. Hello. I will now speak about eugenics and data demography. So, what's the origin of eugenics and the origin of inequality? This came from Europe, and the poor in Europe had a lot of children, so the state had to act in a different way, act upon a couple of problems. First, that poor were rapidly reproducing, having a lot of children. They were not supposed to receive support, because if they received support, then they will have to receive more support. So from there, they developed the laws to look for a balance. That is, control the growth of the majority of the population, that is the poor. So during centuries 16th up to 18th century, uh, poor, undesirable people were sent to Americas to work as servants and to occupy territory. So determinism is the perspective of the will of God, according to what was said by Malthus and Galton. The inheritance of poverty that was considered as a punishment from God to scientific determinism, and alternatives, liberal alternatives, were applied. An universal standard was applied to avoid poor people from reproducing. Malthus in 1698 he publishes Principle of Population. He said that there will be an exponential growth of population versus the lack of of food. So he said there were going to be disasters if we didn't control the population. So he believed that the laws for the to support poor people and increasing their conditions of living, they will multiply, depleting all the resources of the planet. So there will be death and famine. Here we can see the scheme of that determinism, the Malthusian determinism, the population growth along with poverty and famine. That was one of the theories of the time, a theory based on the resources. In reality, that's not how things happen. I'm going to explain how that worked out. The provisions of Malthus never occurred. The exponential curve of Malthus was exaggerated. His broadcast was not real. However, that prevailed for a long time. Gale, a eugenicist from the United States, spoke about Malthusian provisions as stupid. Nowadays, the world produces 5 times more food than what the population actually needs. Problem is, food is controlled by monopolies and it's not well distributed, so there's famine in many places. So next we will talk about Darwin and the evolution of the survival of the fittest. Humans are a result of evolution. According to his work, natural selection leads to preserving the fittest. Darwin developed the evolutionary theory, and he attributed the differences among plants and animals was spontaneous change through natural selection. In this case, Malthus stated that there won't be enough food for everyone because the population grows too much. However, Darwinism and eugenics said that only the best should reproduce and breed. So the policies, the eugenic policies, said that we are too many, that growth should be controlled, especially of those who have more children, the poor, the indigenous, and black people. So the population of European to
migración de indígenas y africanos a los países desarrollados degeneraría estas poblaciones son vistos como una amenaza. En el caso de Lamarck, la teoría neolamarquiana desafió al darwinismo. Él afirmaba que los factores sociales y ambientales se desempeñaban un papel fundamental en el mejoramiento de la raza humana. Predominó en Francia, Italia, Rusia y Latinoamérica. Plantea la importancia de los factores ambientales en los rasgos hereditarios y apoyó el desarrollo de la puericultura. Durante el siglo XX, la eugenesia o el racismo científico vinculaba a las nociones de herencia
scientific
y
racism
límites sociales.
were more into social eugenics. In America, Lamarckism was paired with Galton and paired perspectives. Modern eugenics was substituted the status of Afro descendants and indigenous were still deemed inferior. After the migration law in 1920, the Latin American governments started financing migration of Europeans in order to create white majorities. The mixed race populations become or started to become a part of the Americas, and it has legitimized the national populations, but it made invisible black people and indigenous people, like the cosmic race in Mexico and racial democracy in Brazil. However, here a hierarchy still prevails in the different countries. Racism prevails also in many ways. In Mexico, we already talked about colonization, slavery, independence wars, as well as the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, as well as inequality and racism, and genocide and slavery. There was a war for more than 50 years against colonizers until the Aztec empire was defeated, which led to the genocide of the original populations. Now, original populations are around 7 million people that speak around 68 languages. So there was an assimilation of the population, but they eliminated most of the cultures of indigenous people. Mexico was the third place with Africans that were slaves. Mexico was the only country in Latin America where indigenous, Afro-descendant indigenous actively participated in the independence wars. Actually, one of the leaders of the independence, Vicente Guerrero, was an Afro-descendant. In 1810, the first phase of independent wars was called abolition of slavery, and in 1829, abolition was issued in a decree signed by Vicente Guerrero. Here we can see on the images the genocide, slavery in some of the murals in certain museums that we have in Mexico City that tell a little bit about the trajectory of our history. Here we can talk about eugenics in Mexico during the first phase, which is during Porfirio Diaz dictatorship. Many aspects even before the revolution of 1910. During the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, the notions of nation, science, gender, reproduction, and health management, decreasing of risks, as well as migration, all these elements were based on preventing diseases that were considered hereditary. Cross-race marriage was okay. As well, the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz was exerting some coercion towards these populations. So the idea was to mix Europeans with indigenous people to improve the race. This excluded Afro-descendants, Jews, and Black people, which was part or the specificity of the Mexican eugenics. That is the prevalence of the mixed race Mexican people. The scientific opinions about the introduction of Black people from the United States into Mexico to colonize the northern parts of the country. So they were saying that Black people should work under slavery a situation, otherwise Black race wouldn't work. The habits of Black people, Africans are negligent, slow. That's what they said. Black people have no will to conduct any activity or any empowering activity, according to what Sargo said. That was the first intellectual, Mexican intellectual, well known in Europe. We need to use some sort of submission from Black people. Maybe the Black race will help indigenous people. We need to protect the Belgian people, we need to protect Europeans, because there are scientific proofs of the problematic characteristics of Africans and their descendants. Black and indigenous people have similar defects. The government must foster the immigration of better groups, better human groups. Although Mexico received the third biggest group of slaves, African slaves in the Americas, they were denied by the cosmic race, the Mexican cosmic race. It was only in the year 2010 Afro-American communities were recognized through a population census. From 1879 and 1910, Mexican culture devoted themselves to positivism. So a lot of eugenic scientists came to Mexico. Indigenous, Asians, black people were considered barriers against developing. In 1909, Molina rejects the superiority of white people. In 1910, it was the first revolution of the century that led to the agricultural reform and the abolition of slavery. Then Jose Vasconcelos idealized the mixed race statute, and only Spanish was permitted in at schools, no indigenous languages. So the eugenic debates about maternity, social class, and the different preventive measures looked forward to keep the undesirable aligned, or those who were not supposed to be part of the Mexican family or the Mexican population. So the gender roles were part of prenuptial agreements, also sterilization, and also institutionalization. The eugenics code showed that negative eugenics was widely discussed during the first stages of eugenics in Mexico. The eugenic guidelines were stated at the time in order to protect the big mixed race Mexican family. This was to pathologize groups that were considered unfit to improve the social race. Practices and ideas were reproduced in political studies, population, and education studies. Explicitly, those ideas still persist through language in professional key as a result. Today there are still some racial inequalities. In this case, I don't know if you remember the lady, racist lady that offended a Mexican policeman, telling him that she said, "I hate black people like you." She was not Mexican. However, came to a country where she came from a country where fascism was part of it. So I guess it's part of her culture. And then she came to attack other people here as if she was superior. Half of the Afro-descendant population and those who were not indigenous or Afro-descendant. Then we have 40% of single people and 30% of, single men and 30% of single women. And the rest, in contrast, the indigenous population have wider concentrations of marriages, more than 60%, less proportion of divorcees and widows. The Afro descendants get married between around 21, just like indigenous women who get married in a wider proportion and have more children. The population, the non-indigenous population, lives on nuclear families, which is 61%, while the indigenous populations and Afro descendant populations have a wider proportion of extended families. That is, they live along with sisters, brothers, parents, grandfathers, elders. around 37% because of their cultural practice of sharing the household with the rest of the family, with the extended family. If we speak about the educational system, indigenous people are a racialized group. 80% has not received education, 23% never finished basic basic education. 17% they finished basic education, and only 11% finished high school. In contrast with other populations that are not considered indigenous or Afro-descendant, they have 33.4% with completed high school and 62% with a university level, while Afro-descendant people are in an intermediate position, 20% with complete high school and 21% with a superior or high school, not junior high school, and then a smaller proportion has access to the university. So eugenics is reproducing all the levels of education among indigenous people, Afro-descendants. The cultural values are reflected in matrimony, fertility, as well as in the size and structure of the family. The disadvantages in matter of education uh, implemented since 1940 compelled indigenous people to speak Spanish, and they were not recognized the right to speak their own languages in public spaces also, and indigenous people in general and older practices are still discriminated, so they have progressively uh, eliminated cultural elements of the indigenous population as well as reproducing discrimination. Inclusive education is not enough. Most of them don't have the possibility of fighting for their rights, and most of them they don't self-identify as indigenous, and professors don't necessarily act as anti-racist agents, and they adopt sometimes anti-racist, but they may see conflicts with their environment. It's a paradox, an additional paradox, and also victimization while being excluded from their social networks.
Colonialism, eugenics, and racism, and the perpetuity of colonialism and the occupation of indigenous lands by foreign countries, and the perpetration of eugenics, the criminalization of indigenous, and with violence explicit can produce burnout psychologically and also lower level of education. Affirmative policies that are intercultural need to also develop new strategies against structural colonialism and racism and eugenics, as well as measures to make them visible. And well, that would be my intervention. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Guilherme. Now we can give the floor to Dr. Grecia. She is Afro-descendant and physician, and she's going to be talking to us about eugenics in Mexico. Okay, so good afternoon to everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be here with you. My name is Grecia Rauda. I am a surgeon, and today I'm going to be talking to you about eugenics in Mexico. That is the topic, reproductive health for indigenous fertility in the context in Mexico. The next one, please. Well, actually, I think it is very interesting that the street where we are, it's called Justo Sierra, and so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about this character. Justo Sierra was a Mexican that was born in Campeche around 1848. He was called the Latin America teacher due to his advocacy for education. He was a writer, historian, journalist, poet, and Mexican politician. Likewise, he was a representative in the Congress. Just for you to realize how important he was at the time. Well, just as the previous speaker talked about it, eugenics was something that was very prevalent in the Mexico of those times, and that was precisely during the Mexican Revolution period. Back then, with all of this topic of eugenics, there is a record that Mr. Justo Sierra said the following phrase. I'm going to read it to you. White people or prominent whites, just as the mestizo, Porfirio Diaz. For those of you that don't know, Porfirio Diaz at the time was Mexico's president. So as Porfirio Diaz, as a mestizo, were more fit because indigenous would need to fight with their life, and the best way to make Mexico progress was with European colonialists. The next one, please. So here we are talking about the fact that even then, just as the colleague mentioned, there is this issue of eugenics in Mexico. This is something that has been going on for over a century, from the beginning of the 20th century. And the thing here is also that policies were also carried out that directly affected and systematically affected as well these people that were judged as not fit or not enough. So these systematic policies were trying to control the reproduction of these Afro-Mexican and indigenous communities under this ideology of racial improvement or enhancement. Eugenics was materialized in forced sterilization, even then, and some other medical interventions that were non-consensual. They were falsely justified as public health policies and family planning. Likewise, there was a violation to rights due to this action systematically, deeply violated the rights of people, affecting their health, physically and mentally, and also the autonomy of thousands of people and communities. Next one. Sexual and reproductive health implies that there is a right to freely decide over motherhood or fatherhood, with a full access to information, intercultural adequate services, and the respectful attention to traditions. Traditional doulas are actually a resource that we have in Mexico, and that has been totally separate from the healthcare sector for a very long time, and they wouldn't necessarily include it in the health sector. And because of that, there was a lot of loss of all of these indigenous patients. They wouldn't come, and still they don't, to the healthcare sector because it feels foreign to them. They feel that they don't belong. They say, no, I would rather go or have the doula, let's say, but the ones that they don't tend to have all of the resources, if unlike how that would look like if the support was systematized to these communities, because whenever there are some complications, they tend to happen in very far away areas. And so then we can start talking about systemic barriers. These women from Mexican and indigenous women face multiple barriers. Among those, what I just mentioned, the geographic barriers. We're talking about areas where there are 6 hours away. Imagine that if there is any complication for the pregnant women, then by the time that they can get to the hospital, it's a long time. So that is a huge loss, and it is still a loss. That keeps happening. Deaths keep happening as well of women that just gave birth, or women that are pregnant due to that geographic barrier. Also, the language barrier. Since we're talking about Indigenous women, the language barrier is also very important as well. So the system needs to make it possible for there to have interpreters, that just as we can be here and we can speak to each other and we can perfectly understand each other, that is exactly how that should be like in the entire healthcare system for all of the different languages that are spoken in Mexico. Likewise, discrimination. And this is institutionalized discrimination, because again, we're talking about these patients that tend to be in faraway areas. Okay, they're far away, but then why don't we build a hospital there, right? Where if we see that all of these patients are having some issues to get closer to the nearest hospital, and the situation is getting complicated and they're dying, then we can then create a medical center that is close to them. And of course, there is a lack of access to medical care, and also that is culturally relevant, because yes, they can receive medical care maybe once a month, but if there is any situation when they have left, then the person that is pregnant, it probably can be walking for 3 hours for them to get to the nearest clinic, and they don't always have medication. So we here are also talking about an intercultural model. The healthcare intercultural model in Mexico is trying to guarantee universal access, a dignified treatment, empowerment, but also there are still some very important challenges structurally, like it's the ones that I have already mentioned. Next one, please. So now we're talking about forced sterilization, and it actually has been seen in historical documents. There are medical records and testimonies as well from patients that are revealing that there have been even systematized sterilizations. It's not a situation where the patient is going herself to have a C-section, and even without her consent, sometimes this surgery happens, and that is actually something that is very seen. No, but actually there are even worse cases, and I'm going to be sharing about a case that, just as I mentioned, I come from Guerrero, and this is one of the states where we see these issues the most. We have a lot of Indigenous people, we have a lot of Afro people, and there is not enough care, enough medical care for these people. Invisible practices. We are talking that we're saying that these practices are hidden, actually, deliberately, so that these crimes can still be committed against the reproductive rights of these people. And why? To be able to keep having eugenics, and that is still the problem, because for these people, and I am an Afro-Mexican, and for them, we are not adequate enough so that our health can be important. Next slide, please. Just as Antoine Exupéry said, adults like numbers, so I brought you numbers. Okay, so we're going to be here talking about the impact of Indigenous and Afro-Mexican fertility. There has been a 35% of demographic reduction in the birth rates of communities affected by these issues, a 68% in inequality in terms of access for women, Indigenous women, that report all of these barriers that I just shared for them to receive health care, and 42% of the cultural loss, because this is actually not necessarily going to the next generation, because why we are getting rid of the next generation. So there are 42% of these losses, and after so many years of cultivating this knowledge, this is exactly how we are getting rid of it. So all of this has very deep consequences. in terms of fertility reduction that is altering the entire population dynamics. And also there is indeed a cultural loss. The next one, please. Okay, so this is what I was talking to you about previously, because this is even. I mean, this is not just a matter of rights being violated and women being sterilized, which is what we see the most, but at the same time, there are male victims, as we can see in the middle square. There was a case that actually there was a lot of highlight on it. I mean, there were a lot of articles. It was published in the newspaper that in 1998, so that was not that long ago, there was a case that where systematically to indigenous males, they were victims of sterilization against their will. That also happened in Guerrero. Likewise, indigenous women from Guerrero and Oaxaca, they have reported in many different occasions that there have been forced sterilization in public hospitals. And I mean, the male victims, well, yes, that is true. This happened in 1998. But these cases of women that are reporting these forced sterilizations, that was not something that happened in 1998. The last case that we have, the report that actually is even in the Supreme Court of Justice, that was in 2017. I mean, how long ago was that? That is really nothing. And that is the one case that was reported because, of course, it is very hard for an indigenous woman. I mean, if they cannot even have access to healthcare, why would they even have access to reporting that or filing a complaint? So, of course, this is something that keeps happening. It's very important for all of these issues to be visibilized, that people know that this is still happening. And I mean, of course, I can talk about my state, and Guerrero is having all of these issues. Mexico is having all of those issues because also there are reports about this all over the country, and also civil organizations and feminist collectives. We are still in this fight of demanding justice and repair for the harm that was done to these people. The next one, please. Next one, please. Current challenges. Okay, well, the current challenges and also the path to follow would be to eradicate this coercive practices, because these women are pretty much forced to choose one way, because after they already gave birth, they need to have a way not to get pregnant again. So we need to strengthen public policies, whole complete education, and damage repair. The next one, please. Towards free reproductive health. That is exactly what we're looking for, to have historic memory. We're not going to forget about what has happened in Mexico, because forgetting means repeating. So we need to take into account everything that has happened since the Mexican Revolution over a century ago, and the recognition of this history is definitely fundamental for us to be able to have truly intercultural, equitative and fair healthcare system. And of course, the intention is to treat every person with justice and dignity. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Grecia. And on top of bringing her experience and knowledge, she is also a leader from civil society for Afro-Mexicans. She is the voice that you were asking to hear from civil society. So, okay, now we can give the floor to Yunaira, and she is going to be given a presentation about how eugenics was implemented in the mental health in Mexico. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about eugenics and mental hygiene and neogenics. Next one, please. Okay, so I divided this into phases. You're going to be seeing that throughout the historical context in Mexico, there are different phases, right? So we have the porfirist eugenics that was from 1882 through 1910. This was a perfection science. It was influenced by Dalton. It had biological theories to explain national progress as regeneration. It was promoted by intellectuals with the support of the porfirist government. The main goal was to protect patriotism and national life and avoid the dangers socially could avoid progression. It included inequality. The behavior was given to hereditary aspects and genetics and physiological aspects as well. And it was not just influenced to social conditions. It was also dividing the population in fit and not fit people with an emphasis of controlling reproduction on those that were seen as undesirable. And there was this idea of homogenizing the population, mostly in people that preferably had European and white characteristics, devalorizing what it was indigenous and diversity. Likewise, some correct habits were introduced, school discipline, mostly to be able to moderate this educational side and to sort of present these idealisms in terms of the perfect men and women. Within this, inequality was legitimized and also the interests of the medical elites as presenting it something as natural and needed for progress. So eugenics after the revolution, that was from 1920 through 1940. A novel that really influenced eugenics in Mexico was Eugenia from Eduardo Urzaiz. It was published in 1919. It was actually one of the first works that talked about this topic. The next one was the Athena of Science and Arts. It was also key to discuss it, eugenics, with Mr. Mota Sabreda, and also the Mexican Society in 1931 with this focus of racial hygiene and this enhancement towards populational inheritance. This project also had its own identity, and it was combined with the neo-Lamarckism and the nationalism, as well as the homogenization, and mostly in terms of the mixed race. There was a dominant race explained as a biological matter. We were talking about prophylaxis socially as a social engineering, and this degeneration was associated to people that were alcoholic, criminals, prostitutes, or that they were crazy. Also, there was a reproductive restriction for people considered with hereditary neurosis. That was somebody that was a son of an alcoholic, then they would be degenerated and it wouldn't be something productive for society. Next slide, please. This chart is presenting the action lines of eugenics that happened through from 31st through 50. Among these lines, we had anti-alcoholic prophylaxis and sterilization, among others. Within nuptial control was the intention of avoid hereditary diseases with these forced agreement, and the critique was to have a restriction of these rights, then to reduce birth, death, with help to mothers. The critique was patriarchal control over motherhood. And then when it came to alcoholism, it was associated to generation. And some of these campaigns were used, and the critic was the criticizing of the worker sector, and sterilization, which was to avoid the reproduction of undesirable with some criminal proposals. The next one, please. Within mixed race and this exclusion, there was a criticism as soft eugenics, and there was a rhetoric of the cosmic race that would promote the disappearance of the indigenous person as a differentiated category. This magazine was analyzed as a project, and it actually was like this city where there was the perfect people. It is interpreted as an idealist text and the elite that was thinking that biology could solve all of the issues that the society had. Next one, please. Some historic milestones within the Mexican story. In 67, San Hipólito Hospital was founded, but there was a systematic aspect for people that needed mental health facilities. In 1910, La Castañeda was inaugurated. That was a place that also was classified according to the mystery because it didn't just have some psychiatric patients, but also patients that were in poverty. Afterwards, in 29, there were criminal codes where the concept of the dangerous state was introduced and also social defense. In 31st, the Mexican Society for Eugenics. In 32, the Veracruz Eugenics law. In 45, the farm of San Pedro Monte. That was also a psychiatric model that was disguised more than anything, but at the end would also place or actually make patients work. Likewise, the Castañeda operation here, the intention was to sort of remove that idea of a specific place where the degenerated needed to be kept, and instead it was more towards community idealism. There was a creation of Genomics National Institute in 2004, and then in 2022 there was a reform of the general law, health law, where there was a change for mental health hospitals, and the intention was to move it more towards supports for the families to be able to collaborate with the work that the family was doing for the patient, and now to make that a support or some type of help for the family. The next one, please. The consolidation and the crisis of this model. We're in this stage after this model of isolation collapses and La Castañeda as a mental hospital was focused only on managing craziness. The goal for this place was to manage treatment for patients. However, they also treated patients with syphilis, alcoholism, epilepsy, more than severe madness, and mostly there were marginally matters. So these models suffered a crisis. Institutionally, it was overwhelmed, and the critique highlights that it could make this or turn this into diagnosis, mostly included matters of race, gender, and class. Afterwards, we have the farms and also somatic therapies. These type of institutions collapse, and so then this was another type of places where the degenerated were kept, but it was pretty much reproducing the same scheme of controlled violence, right? So these farms of mental ill people suffer with the saturation, for example, in San Pedro del Monte, and they also started to use therapies known as labor therapy, where there were some agricultural activities that were used to make the person, mentally ill person, work. Likewise, also there was an enthusiastic adoption of electroconvulsive therapy and lobotomy as well, that was described as a technique to manage overpopulation and the dangerousness, frequently without an informed consent, under this logic of cure, treatment, and pacification. So when these closed in 68, then La Castañeda operation started to be interpreted as this modernization, mostly because back then, in those years, we were going to have the Olympic Games. So people didn't want to be perceived as that. La Castañeda, likewise, also started to move patients to the periphery, and then we could keep the situation that was still there. Well, the lobotomy happened in 35 with Antonio Egas, and then and electroconvulsive therapy during the 30s in Italy. The next one, please. Lobotomy, well, here we're going to see that more than a cure, it actually didn't cure, but instead it calmed patients, but it had a huge brain cost. There was no information. It was applied to women, poor women, without their will. The Nobel Prize that was provided at the time was seen as a mistake, and this pressure was an emblem of the anti-psychiatric movements of the 60s, 70s. So in conclusion, lobotomy was de facto prohibited worldwide by medical consensus, where there are explicit regulations, for example, in Russia since 1950, and also in different states in the United States. Likewise, that responded to historical rejection to this practice that violated human rights, and its legacy adverts about non-proved interventions and also the importance of psychiatric ethics.
Electroshocks, we'll see that many countries such as Slovenia, Italy, and Mexico, and Switzerland prohibited because of ethical decisions. In the United States, in Texas, it was only prohibited in people under 17. Because of abuse, it was applied as punishment for patients who were interned in psychiatric institutions. They lost memory, there was confusion, and there was criticism for the potential use as a control issue. They called it a curative therapy, but it was more like torture. From this, there was the failed reform anti-psychiatric from 1970. Mexico was saying, yes, we're going to change the attention to psychiatric patients, but this desinstitutionalization only considered the integration of the family, changing the paradigm. They were more associated to psychopharmacy. And at a regional level, thanks to the Declaration of Caracas, it was a way of fostering the reforms in Latin America. It has this institutional aspect, but there was an intellectual debate also to denounce psychiatry. And during the 1970s, the psychiatric label, could be used to water down the criticism. Likewise, the crazy people was stigmatized, and there was a social exclusion as a structural mechanism that reproduced. There was a stigma because also because of a psychiatric diagnosis that had impact on a daily basis. They were said to be dangerous, or that they were like children, so therefore they were excluded institutionally and socially. A lot of barriers to ask for help because they didn't want to ask for help because they were going to be recognized as people, as undesirable people. An important model was the Hidalgo model, that was a proposal, and it was an attempt to reform the psychiatry in Mexico at the end of 1990. They wanted to leave the hospital, or the mental hospital, and they were supposed to substitute gradually a psychiatric hospital at the first level and in general unities, and also in transitions to integrate these people to the society. The reason of its failure is because there was a lot of bureaucracy. There was not enough there were not enough medicines, and there was a lot of coercion, especially because patients in this kind of institutions were held back because they didn't leave behind certain attitudes. So there was a lot of physical contention against the patients. In the reform of 2022 and the recent agenda between 2022 and 2024, we started to see a change to leave this isolation model behind, and to start to dismantle hospitals and create a community network, a more solid one, to not produce any abandonment or let these people end up on the street or in jail. In 2024, well, care, ambulatory care, and support for the families. And today we have the genomics and molecular racialization, the part where this institute conducts projects with Mexican genoma, and this genomic medicine is translated in national logics, where it is given or it creates the molecular mixed race and reinforces the idea of an homogeneous country. And today, what is called new eugenics of the market and reproductive control. It's new eugenics because we have this idea, this market idea where reproduction occurs. I am part of, well, assisted reproduction, pre-implantation, conditioned access, amplification of social hierarchies, and obstetric violence. Here we can see on this table some comparisons between what's classical operations showing what was before and what is happening today. As a conclusion, well, it's not something from the past. Eugenics and mental hygiene prevail as logics that inhabit the languages and the market logics. It's still a certification, or still part of the certification, also the production of gametes, determine who are fit for reproduction and who are not. So purchase power conditions the possibility to access biological improvement, and this genomic medicine could inscribe colonial and categories, pathologizing the indigenous inheritance, and it can document the resistance from patients compiled by historians as well as activists from human rights that check out what is going on in these institutions. These people are treated differently and excluded by society. Thank you. Thank you, Yunaira, for your amazing presentation. And now I will give the floor to our commentator. I would like to introduce you to Verónica Esparza. She's a lawyer from the Free School of Law. She has a master's degree in habeas corpus from the Ibero-American University in Mexico City, and she also had some education on the University of Spain. She's a judicial researcher, and since December of 2021, she's coordinator in the area of investigation. Previously, she was an independent researcher, and part of her results have been published in specialized magazines. She has also worked on the National Commission of Human Rights in Mexico City, where she has worked in different areas. She coordinates the area of the HIRE, which is an area, a research area. Veronica is going to comment on the presentations of our panelists. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the invitation. I see that there's a lot of people who are not from Mexico. I work in the HIRE, which is a an organization, non-profit organization, feminist, that emerged in 1992 in order to position abortion and give information, scientific information, non-religious information around abortion. And in 2011, we added the agenda to the agenda assisted reproduction, reproductive life along with working life. I am coordinator of that area, and from that place, I would like to comment the participations of today, my expertise, and through my expertise and the expertise of the organization. And I think it has everything to do with all these interventions. I would like to start by bringing back something that has been fundamental in this colloquium. Eugenics cannot be thought of as an obscure chapter or something closed that has a closure during the 20th century. If we confine history to something that happened in other languages, in other contexts, then we are at risk of not noticing how it is so present in the present day. These are not practices that are necessarily out of the current context of our country. That's why I suggest that rather than affirming the existence of an eugenic project per se, what I suggest is exploring how certain contemporary ways of regulating reproduction can reflect partially and indirectly and in a normalizing way historically associated with the control of population. Maybe from here we could understand eugenics less than something that happened in a previous century, but more like an analytical framework in order to observe the continuities in the effects that still persist today. Particularly, this could help us to notice how certain decisions or certain medical practices or technical criteria generate differences in autonomy, reproductive autonomy. That is, who decides or who has the freedom to decide, and versus who has or who is under vigilance. So here I bring back something that was previously mentioned by Guilherme, Grecia, and Yunaira, which is the historical aspect that can help us understand where this came from. It shows that eugenics in Mexico didn't operate just through explicit policies or extreme episodes, also through tools that were historically present as techniques and as objectives such as statistics, demography, and the production of census. This analysis helps us to understand how speeches about population, mixed race, and the social improvement, so to speak, were part of how what were contributing to create certain populations, especially indigenous populations and racialized populations, as well as poor populations, were thought of as problems, as risks from reproductive justice. This displacement is key because it leads us to understand more through effects how our knowledge has decided who has the right to decide upon their life and reproduction rights, who is under the control, who is under the coercion of the institutions. I think the presentations helps us to understand that many of the inequalities that we observed on reproductive health are not spontaneous. They are rooted to a long history of production of knowledge and value of life. I think that here it's important to stop a little bit and focus on the concept of reproductive justice. For my institution, this term means, or this concept of reproductive justice means that women or people able to get pregnant can have total agency and self determination over their reproductive destiny. I think it's not just about recognizing human rights, but ensuring conditions, social, economic, and institutional conditions that allow to make these decisions in an informed, non-coerced, free way. It's important to highlight something here, which is this demands an obligation from the state. It's not just that the state should not interfere. We must create environments that can enable this freedom, especially certain contexts that are under structural imbalances. In Mexico, it's important to say that we can see how this eugenic logics are part of our reality. They're not abstract. They were talking about the data, and of course, for my institution, it's the data is important because they reflect or they help us understand intuitions that from organizations of civil society we can see on the cases that we know about. In obstetric violence, which is a phenomenon not only from the Mexican context but also in the Mexican context, we have information that shows where these inequalities occur. The National Survey of the relationships in the households, it measures different types of violence against women, and in 2016 integrated to the measurement obstetric violence. That is the perception of the treatment women receive during their last childbirth. This is important in order to measure this type of violences. And it's important because it shows that between 2016 and 2021, the time during which the survey was conducted, it shows that 1 in 3 women who had a childbirth at the time reported at least one manifestation of this obstetric violence. This prevalence and this persistence is alarming, especially if we know or if we are aware that there's a normative framework and if there are institutional protocols and if we have public policies that have been imposed to eradicate this phenomenon. However, there has not been a diminish or an important diminish in this type of violences. What this is telling us is that we are in the face of we're not facing individual or isolated failures. We are actually in the face of structural ways of organizing reproductive attention. So, obstetric violence in that regard works as a mechanism that allows the intervention of certain bodies even without even without dignity and without institutional effects, without institutional consequences. So it's not just a matter of violence, it also has to do with hierarchies that tolerate these situations or these conditions. So, as I said before, this is not an abstract. These are very concrete experiences, and very concrete experiences, such as what Grecia mentioned. There are some cases that can become examples. When we talk about data, sometimes we are under the risk of believing or thinking about numbers, but when we hear stories, I think it's easier to understand the situation besides the numbers. So these hierarchies are not just abstract, they translate into experiences. And there are a number of variables that this survey help us understand, which are the bodies that are being controlled and which are the variables. And one of these variables is age. In these interventions, they were talking about age as an important factor when it comes to coerce the decisions of younger women. This survey shows that between 15 and 19 years, the higher the prevalence of obstetric violence. So all of this attention, medical attention that should be more specialized because of the potential complications of pregnancy in this age group, rather than helping them, this group of people, this age group, suffers more violence and more social sanctions. This is reflected in many of the obstetric violence instances in this age group. So there's no consent or informed consent. They sometimes do not accept a contraceptive, or there's no, they don't ask for their express authorization. We can also incorporate other variable, which is disability. Disabilities become deeper when disability appears as a factor. Half of women with disabilities reported obstetric violence in their last childbirth. So when we put together um, young age along with disability, more than half of women received violence or were subject to violence. So there is a violation of reproductive agency in the case of psychosocial disability or neurodivergence. This lack of agency of these women leads to internments, regimes that are not well designed, or ways that look forward to suppress the will of these women and substitute it with the will of the government. So the decision making is put into other hands, on the authorities, on their families, but never the subject itself or herself. So eugenics is not always manifested through walls or through certain specific ways of violence. Maybe a lack of institutional awareness. I think that the axis here is the hierarchies of these lives. Previously, we've been repeating this over and over, which bodies are fit to become mothers, which maternities are considered to be a burden for the state, and under which conditions a reproductive decision is displaced from the person to the institutions. Here, as Grecia mentioned, Yunaira both mentioned before, here there are some barriers of communication as part of the factors, power imbalances between the physicians and the users, racism, ableism, poverty, and the idea that there are some lives that require supervision. Eugenics does not depend only from a discourse or a speech about improvement, but it's also about the normalcy um, of devices of administration that are supposed to decide for you instead of letting you make that decision. Now that we are placing this on the Mexican context, if we also observe other international organisms, we clearly see, for example, women, children, people with disability, they face obstacles to exert or to exercise their reproductive freedom because they are subject to restrictive frameworks, stigma, and the lack of proper health services, which are fundamental for this type of interventions. And of course, this favors the persistence of these coercive practices like forced sterilization or non-consented sterilization, contraception, imposed contraception, and forced abortions. For abortions for this type of populations, it's like a two-faced morals. On one hand, you have these groups that are not in favor of people deciding on their or about what to do with their own bodies, but in these cases, abortion is actually a suggestion for these groups of people, like as if in this case it was justified that these people should abort. In a parallel way, indigenous women face risks and violences that are not different because of culture, but because of structural inequalities that are so embedded in culture. Here, it's important to recognize the limits of the public data. Actually, the survey that I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, although it doesn't show a clear difference between indigenous women and other population, it doesn't mean that it doesn't truly show the reality. I think what it shows is that the statistical instruments can be important. They not always capture all the experiences. Grecia was mentioning some numbers, also linguistic barriers, service barriers because the health services are not close to the communities. if the information is accessible to the end users. So all of this can be a reflection of all this lack of data. From that perspective, the work that we do from the organizations or from the civil society organizations, in this case, my organization, the HIRE, but also Grecia, from the organization where she works, all this complements data with the reality. We can see patterns that have to do with denying information, decisions that substitute the will of the patients, forced sterilization, barriers to have access to reproductive health. So this is a matter of continuity. This is part of the structure. I was laughing a little bit, Grecia, with your comment, like in 1998, not so long ago, and I was remembering that in 1998, I started working on the National Commission of Human Rights, and I was part of the recommendation made by the National Commission about forced sterilization towards indigenous people or indigenous population. Non-consented sterilization because they were supposed to be subject to these vasectomies or apparently this was framed as a benefit included with social or health benefits. It was like a benefit, and that was a recommendation from 2002. And what I was saying, speaking about these patterns that we've seen from civil society, here's where eugenics stops being abstract and it becomes an analytical tool, not because we want to avoid reproduction, but because certain protocols, practices, and judgments on who should reproduce and who should not, they reproduce again structural inequalities, and this can operate silently in a technical but also in a very normalized way. So it's sometimes hard to identify and question. In the experience of HIRE, my institution, the response is supposed to be completely anti-eugenics. The interrogation is who is recognized as a subject able to make decisions, and what bodies are systematically treated as problematic, unable, or undesirable. In the case of indigenous women, we have documented how consent is not there, especially when decision making is done under the perception that these people need to be coerced. So how do we measure these lives, and also how do we make access or make access available for this type of populations? Our job is not just to give names, but also dismantle the structural inequalities that make them possible. That is, questioning the frameworks and also the imaginaries that sustain these inequalities, but at the same time, imagine ways of taking care, ways of decision making that could be better and based on interdependence and not in coercion and not based on a perception of a difference. Data, experiences, and historical fights show that this is not a problem from the past and from other contexts. It's a challenge, an urgent challenge for the present, and at the same time, we should be taking this as an opportunity for the future, where dignity and the necessity of shared care should be the criteria for the years to come. Here, I would like to pose three questions for dialogue.
I would like to clarify, actually, that I am not trying to find comfortable answers, but instead to force us to see what is happening in the practice. I'm not really saying either that these questions should be responded right now. but my intention would be to maybe put a seed in regarding some concerns that hopefully would go beyond today and beyond these events. The first question would be how to identify these continuities in institutional practice. And what I mean by this is how can we recognize those violences or controls that are not exceptional anymore, but instead these are presented are normal and legitimate procedures, decisions that are made without full consent, practices that are justified as care or protection, or protocols that are actually removing the decisions of people. Another question would be how tensions between the regulation frameworks and experiences specifically can be shown. That is to say, to what extent with a language, consent, autonomy, or non-discrimination are enough to describe what people are actually experiencing when they're interacting with institutions. In the practice, they are still operating from the lack of trust, from that hierarchy of certain lives. And the last question has to do with the challenges of thinking about these concepts of reproductive justice in contexts that actually have to do with persistent inequality. And the concern here is as follows: how transformative are our current frameworks if they are still leaving the conditions intact, the conditions that make it possible for some reproductive decisions to be supervised, corrected, or just directly substituted? What are we willing to question truly? And well, probably I would leave it there. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Verónica, for your amazing contribution to this debate with a lot of many interesting insights and data. And so now it is time to give the floor to the audience for you to ask questions. Can you give them the microphone? We have two people here, one back there, another one over here in the front.
Thank you very much for. Oh my God, I learned.
Muchas gracias. Dios mío, aprendí muchísimo.
So I think my question.
Bueno, pues supongo que mis preguntas vienen entonces desde
Someone who has absolutely no knowledge about the Mexican situation. So please forgive me if I'm actually asking really naive questions. The first question is about to Guilherme and about this idea of mixed race. So I got the impression that you mentioned and you argue that the idea of or categorization or values associated with mixed race
con el mestizaje en el contexto mexicano, pues en realidad cambiaron a lo largo del periodo histórico. No sé si estoy en lo correcto para pensar en ese sentido.
I wasn't also quite clear about this notion of mixed race and how that actually relates to the marginalization and kind of discrimination of other categories of indigenous population and Black population in Mexico. So if you could elaborate that a little bit, that would be really helpful. I think I call this idea of the cosmic race. So in the Mexican context, how did that actually manifest? I'm asking this question because it comes out of my knowledge of East Asian history and how kind of the idea of mixed race, in fact, manifested over the modern period. In the East Asian context, this idea of mixed race was in fact mobilized during the wartime to, in a way, justify the Japanese colonization of Manchuria, Korea, and Taiwan. This biological idea of hybrid rigor was mobilized to justify mixed race as well. But after the war, this idea of mixed race became almost like a tainted notion. as Japan was rebuilt as a monoethnic. This is a narrative. It wasn't actually the case, but as a monoethnic nation. So I just wanted to know a little bit about this notion of mixed race in the Mexican context. The second question is to you, Grecia. I was very almost shocked that the forced sterilization continued even in the. I mean, it seems like even to the present. I want to know a little bit more about the demographics of those who are on the receiving end of forced sterilization. Was that? I mean, you mentioned that there were men and women who were on, who actually received forced sterilization. What was the proportion? I mean, from the data you can tell, age, and were there certain categories of people within the local population who were more prone to forced sterilization than others? And also a question for you, and I would like to also know your everyday experiences or everyday practices of a challenge you mentioned about trying to eliminate coercive practices. How does that actually, what do you do in your everyday situation? So I'm just curious to know. Thank you.
Pasamos a otra pregunta para que pueda juntar.
Okay, maybe we can go to another question. We don't have a lot of time, so maybe we can go to another question.
Una pregunta. Bueno, y de hecho he escuchado este tema.
I have a question. I have actually heard about this topic, and it has caught my attention in other panels. And my question would be why epilepsy was stigmatized. I'm actually asking because I have epilepsy. So hearing about that was sort of like something that made me think, well, what was the history behind that? Especially because you've talked about this sector of Eugenics. Well, thank you very much to all of the panels. These were very interesting presentations. My question had to do with the topic of forced sterilizations in the Mexican context. I mean, if we're talking about the contemporary context that you have worked on, but also a little bit historically. And I'm asking this partly because, well, for those of us that have studied the history of eugenics in Mexico, a little in comparison to other regions and countries in the world, it is a little common, really, to hear that eugenics in Mexico was softer. The law of the 32 was referred to a lot in Veracruz that would allow sterilizations, but there is really no evidence that those were actually practiced. But there is always this suspicion that probably there were. However, there is no really way to prove it. So my question had a little bit more to do with, I mean, when we have something so intimate and so violent and so strong as sterilization, that probably sometimes we can imagine that this goes hand in hand with sexual abuse or rape of patients. I mean, how can we track that history and that matter of when does it exist, when doesn't it exist? That maybe has to do with that dynamic between what is visible and public versus what is hidden, right? And a little bit of how that has been worked on in the field historically and also currently. Gracia, maybe you can start. I think that most of the questions are directed to you. Okay. Well, answering to the question, well, yes, this is actually very related to what the other colleague was mentioning. Forced sterilization has been a matter that is very hidden. There have been actually very few the people that are reporting these type of aggressions or assaults. Actually, the case that I was sharing with you that even got all the way to the Supreme Court of Justice, in that case, that was a couple where the lady was being told that, well, your husband has already signed, and then the husband was being told, you need to sign because your wife is really, really not okay, and he couldn't even really sign. He didn't even know. And then he pretends, and then they go to the lady, and they were like, you need to have a surgery. But why? Well, your husband already signed, and so we need to have surgery on you. So it is very complicated for people that have all of that background to even get close to reporting these situations. So it is very complicated to have a real figure of the number of forced sterilizations that are being practiced. And apart from forced sterilizations, there has also been many other types of violations of sexual and reproductive rights of women, mostly in segregated communities. Just as the colleague was mentioning, these abortions have also been relevant with the consent and without the consent of the patient has been relevant. So the question about demographics, I don't really have data. There are really no real data that would be able to answer that question because usually what happens is that when the C-section is done, in that same cut, let's say, sometimes they also take the baby out, then they sterilize the woman, they close back, and there's really no way for you to even know that you were sterilized because you only see the scar. So that is also the thing as well. It is very, very incredibly hard for people to know when these women have been assaulted in being sterilized against their will. So I don't know if I answered the question. A lot of people don't know that they were sterilized. Yes, a lot of people don't even really know that. Con la histerectomía, ¿no? Una disculpa, sin el micrófono no se escucha. Does anybody else have a question, or does anybody want to respond? Well, yes, talking about epilepsy and why it was stigmatized back then. During the Middle Age, the belief that was that people that suffered these convulsions, since we were talking about these convulsions and people didn't really know, I mean, they had these seizures and they were wondering what was going on, what was happening. That made people to be perceiving epileptics as dangerous, but they thought that they were cursed, that they were cursed by God, or that they had a demon inside. And so that is why they were stigmatized as well, and they were treated as well as degenerated people. Well, yes, regarding the question about Mexicans, and regarding the colonization from the Spain colonization to Mexico and without prejudice, what is happening is that here in Mexico, this mixed race, or mestizos as they're also referred to, or mixed race as they can also be referred to as well, that perspective changed. But the issue is that this was only between Indigenous and Spaniards. The rest of the races and ethnics are excluded because they were actually centered in other areas of the country. For example, the coast of Guerrero, the state of Veracruz, but they were more like reserved to these specific areas. And some of them went to the northern area in Mexico, running away from the United States, in Coahuila specifically, where the president back then, Benito Juarez, gave them a piece of land for them to be able to live there. It is located in the municipality of Musquis in Coahuila, and so there they are the tribes of Mascogos, or better known as Seminoles as well. and that was founded by John Horse, or also known as Juan Caballo. And he was the founder of Mascogos and also of the indigenous tribes of the United States that ran away, that were the Kicapus tribes. So even today, they live between Mexican and American territory because they fought for keeping their nationality of where they were originally from, which actually were in the United States, but they are Mexican by birth. I don't know if with that I responded to the question, or maybe if you have any other question. Thank you. Okay, any more questions or comments? You can also make comments as audience. Okay, there is a hand raised too. Yes, good afternoon. I have a question. And so currently, in the face of the practices that are that we're having in terms of birth control, abortion, sterilization, do they happen due to negligence and a lack of competence and racism instead, more than of a state policy? Or is there still maybe some type of state policy that aims to have some type of birth control, especially when we are talking about these situation with people? Was there another question, by the way? So that everybody can respond. Primero que nada, muchísimas gracias por las presentaciones y por las respuestas. Uno de los temas que ha seguido surgiendo en los últimos días es el poder volver a humanizar a las personas que son víctimas de este tipo de transgresiones. Y yo me pregunto con respecto a la posibilidad de capturar
from people who have been transgressed against, and what are the limitations in terms of regulations and laws, but also the vulnerability of people who would share their stories, right? Because I think it's actually through telling these stories over time that you can create these patterns of continuity that are borne out in the data. And I think the data can be really a powerful tool, but sort of living in Silicon Valley, one of the things that I've experienced and watched happen within different movements is how the data actually facilitates an affective distancing from the subject. They become a number rather than a human being. So I'm thinking about ways in which we might use narratives, stories, testimonies as a way of reconnecting people's humanity with what the patterns that are borne out by the data. So.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Quiero agradecer a Verónica por
I
haber...
want to thank Verónica for having accepted the invitation. Thank you so much, Verónica, for the huge contribution that you provided. I have two questions here. First, my first one has to do with, well, about a year or 2 years ago, Mexico approved the legal capacity law that obviously eliminates, or should eliminate, the interdiction law. And so this interdiction law, Veronica, I understand that it has a lot to do with forced sterilizations, also non-consented or non-authorized abortions. So I would love to know a little bit more, Veronica, about how these legal capacity law could be used as a type of a strategy to be able to fight against this transformed eugenics that now we are seeing with a different shape or with a different form. That on the one hand. And on the other hand, maybe try to understand how organizations such as HIRE, your organization, could have presence, I guess, through in the practice, that is, when we're talking about concepts like reproductive justice, to keep going with us this anti-eugenics fight, and also to promote more broader knowledge for population in terms of what is eugenics, the new forms that are taking place of it, and how to resist it, how to fight against it, etc. Thank you. Yes, okay, well, first of all, I would like to refer to the suggestion of using the experiences of people, and of course not just using data. I think that is part of what we're trying to do in our organization. Actually, I would like to invite you to go to our website, and in 2016 we created a symbolic court where what is shown precisely is the experiences that actually are told by survivors of obstetric violence, whether it's from the users or family members that tell that story, and also the impact that this has on the lives of people when they are victims of this type of violence. Beyond, well, and also probably by responding to the other comment of whether this has to do with negligence, I think yes, there are cases where this has everything to do with negligence. When we're talking about obstetric violence, the intention and what we're seeking to do is to show that these are not individual actions, but instead these are institutional actions. I mean, this is the structural problem. Treating it as negligence or as an isolated matter, what that would generate is precisely to have maybe, yes, some actions that were like or try to correct something individual, but instead we're talking about an institutional and structural violence, and the intention is to have full transformation. And I think this also has to do with the fact that many times the idea is that criminalization could be an exit for these type of violences, that is to create a crime and then prosecute it. But from our organization, the criminal aspect is not going to solve a structural issue. So criminal aspects is just moving responsibility and is putting it on a person, and the structure is not going to change. The actual issue is not going to be eradicated. The root cause is still going to be there. There's still going to be structural issues, lack of trained staff. There will still be lack of everything that has to do with the whole structural aspect of things that the criminal path is not solving. Now, also talking about your question, Beatriz, yes, part of what we're trying to do by eliminating these interdiction figures, it has to do with that. But many times what we're missing is a harmonization of all of these legislative machinery or framework. Because, for example, if we think about an official law 005 for family planning, it still suggests the practice of the salpingo surgery, for example, as a contraception, permanent contraception method in people. And here I'm going to quote it because that is exactly how it is written in the official law. And that is whenever there is a mental retardness. And clearly that is where you probably would think, well, clearly there should be, I mean, it's not enough to change paper. It's not enough to change the regulatory framework if these practices and protocols and public policies persist that are not actually adapting or adequating to the reality. I think there was another question addressed to Grecia. Apologies, we cannot really hear without the microphone. Yes, if this is just a structural matter. Yes, there was a question regarding if there is still state policy from the state of having a birth control or traditional practices based on eugenics, and the other one had a little to do with whether this would be an individual negligence practice or instead if these practices without consulting the patient and forced sterilizations are structural and institutional. Well, I think that is what I wrote down. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, it was a lot that I forgot. It is not precisely a law per se. I mean, yes, there is a suggestion that is made to the women that already gave birth to, for her to choose a contraception method, and that is very important so that there is no another pregnancy before her body is ready for it. But that has absolutely nothing to do with the fact of her receiving the salpingo surgery. And sorry, it's not a hysterectomy, it's salpingoclasia. And that is a method that is permanent. And for that, there definitely needs to be informed consent from the patient. That should not be protocolized, and it should not be taking place against the patient's will. That is just, as the colleague mentioned, that would be and qualify as obstetric violence. And there is a totally separate protocol. It is true that, yes, it could also be seen on the legal aspect of things, but institutionally speaking, they are really paying a lot of attention to obstetric violence. We still have cases, yes, definitely, of course, but we haven't found yet a way to correct that. And so, yes, and I also remembered the previous question, and I go back to it, in terms of, well, the collective where I am a member of. What we're trying to do is we are trying to repair that problem. And a big part of why these patients are transgressed actually is due to the lack of information. So that is sort of the weapon that we are trying to give the women from the communities that we work with. We go to the communities, and even when they are kids in school age, they receive information about their reproductive and sexual rights, the types of family planning that they can choose from, so that, number one, they can make the decision in terms of how they want to live their sexuality, of course, but also so that whenever they face these type of situations, they also know how to defend and exercise their own rights. I don't know if I responded the questions. Are there any other questions? I would just like to add to what Grecia mentioned, because I mean, the law and the policies in Mexico do not allow these practices, and that has been the case for a very long time. The control of fertility policy actually changed, and now it actually even has a different name for sexual and reproductive health and right. And even though it has been the name for a very long time, actually there is a body in Mexico that is called the National Council of Population. That is exactly what that is for. And what they promote is to have the policy of maybe having 2 kids per family. They say the small family lives better. That is the official propaganda or phrase that they have used for a very long time. So there was this promotion of making everybody having maybe a small family. And who are the ones that never managed to do that? Indigenous people, right? Because they are the only ones that didn't have 2 kids per woman. They have on average 3.5. So actually, if they kept that policy, it would be addressed to Indigenous people. But that is also part of their culture, just as we saw with Guilherme, right? So they marry early, 18 years old, sometimes 16 years old. Actually, there are even legal issues because some of them are 14, 15 years old and they want to get married and it's not allowed. That would be a crime and then they should be arrested. But that is not practiced either. But that is part of their culture for them to marry early, have a lot of kids. So when we're talking about teenage pregnancies, we're talking a lot about Indigenous peoples, because when it's a teenage pregnancy of a middle-class girl, her parents most of the times help her or finance the abortion, or they help her taking care of the child. The thing is that in most cases, these are happening between Indigenous people. And so if we don't make that clear, we could actually be having eugenics with Indigenous people. And on the other hand, the Mexican state signed already the agreements to include the Treaty of Human Rights in the Mexican legislation. So Mexican legislation is linked to and submitted to the Human Rights Agreement or Treaty. So any violation and transgression to human rights is a crime in Mexico after that, right? So what the state does is as open and as transparent as possible, but how can we deconstruct decades and centuries of eugenic formation of healthcare professionals? That is the question. That is what is very complicated. How can we change the head of bureaucracy that was educated under eugenics? And so the deconstruction of that is very recent in the law, right? And also in the ruling and regulations of healthcare services. Yes, there are advances, there are changes, there are reports, and in legal aspects as well. For example, Mexico just chose its Supreme Court, and for the first time, they have an indigenous president in the Supreme Court. So obviously, there is an entire array of possibilities to keep moving forward and advancing with a legal and regulatory framework to be able to regulate those practices and then eradicate the violations to human rights. But that is a process. That is not going to happen overnight. I mean, it was only last year when the Supreme Court was changed. And in the state legislations, they had some advancements in some states according to the movements of women and NGOs and also the governments of the states. But it is an entire process, just as with migration, that you need to take baby steps. But what I think is that it is a crime against human rights, even if it's just one person. And yes, that there needs to be some type of punishment, because otherwise, I mean, I see that in many practices that I have had of trainings, and I mean, we're training physicians, but if the person already has a formed mindset, then the training is not going to have an impact on their ideology. I have seen, for example, a Black woman physician that we were training her on racism, and in the training she was fighting with the trainers. But that is not the case. That is not true. Those ladies only want to go party. They don't want to study. Black women are like that, and she was Black herself. I mean, somebody that already thinks that way, if she has to deal with a pregnant woman, a Black pregnant woman, she had the power to do whatever she wanted, and the girl was never going to figure out about it, right? So there is a difference between power and decision making between the healthcare professional and the patient. That is precisely what Grecia was mentioning. And in this power inequality, the doctor, the physician is the one deciding, and there is really no way for the patient to know what is the technique, for her to know what they are doing on her. You are pretty much on their hands, and they can do whatever they want. So that is where the thing is. And if you don't have a punishment of this crime that goes against the human right of women, that is also crime according to the medical practice, because there is a Hippocrates pledge, right? So there are different violations that are taking place in that aspect. Discovering is hard, yes, because not even the patient knows herself, right? But we need to keep advancing in terms of laws, in terms of regulations, and also in the surveillance of the medical practice. That is very hard. It's the hardest, but it's important as well. For example, now in Brazil, it was recently discovered that there were 3 nurses that were discovering actually 2 more that were accomplices, and they killed 3 patients that were under intensive care, and they applied detergent in their veins.
Physicians, 20 something, early 20s, they killed these 3 people, a young person and 2 elder people. And the only coincidence they found is that the 3 were obese. And the hospital made an investigation and discovered them injecting substances in the veins without any medical authorization. So, how do we control that? These people were discovered because, well, because there were videos. But if there's an indigenous clinic in the mountain of Guerrero, it's hard. But still, we have to insist on moving forward, and that we need to have conditions because these are crimes. Someone else would like to comment something? Apparently, there are no more questions. I think we are done. We ran out of time, so just saying thanks to the people on the panel and thanks for the participations. Thanks for your questions.